Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Here on this show, we interview innovators in governance and explorers of new realms. Today on this show, we have a mixture of both. He was aboard the bathysphere tree stay when it made its record maximum descent into the Mariana Trench in the 1960s. Also, for the past 4 decades, he has made over 70 polar expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic regions and is an expert in governance of that whole region. So, thank you so much for being here, Don.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Don, why don't you start off with explaining what the system of governance is in Antarctica?
In 1961 came the Antarctic Treaty, which basically said all claims that have been made to date are to be held in abeyance. They were not canceled. I think politically that had been too hard to get several nations to renounce their colonial claims, but they're held in abeyance. In other words, you don't take any colonial action. You can maintain your claim, your right of claim, but you can't act on it. And that worked. This is an example of an international treaty that set, metes and bounds for performances and activities and geography, if you will, use of areas for international well-being. Now, the black side of that, of course, because there's no government, singular government running the Antarctic, the idea of enforcing treaties and various activities that came out of the treaties, such as considerations of fishing, mining, and all of that, and also pollution and waste management, so on. All of those things are somewhat voluntary because there's no police force or Coast Guard to enforce them. So you do have problems with fishermen, commercial fishing organizations coming in and taking the resources without any kind of quota limits, and so and putting things at risk. So that it can be sorted out, but it's not as easy if you had a strong central government and essentially a law enforcement agency down there. The various, of course, in all international treaties that are signed, they're between governments, not individuals. So if our government signs a treaty, then it also takes force of domestic law. So the things that are prohibited through the Antarctic Treaty are also prohibited to U.S. citizens with the force of domestic law. So it's not completely a situation where you're operating in the Wild West. It's just more difficult. For example, tourism, which was not contemplated when the treaty was being done in the late 50s and signed in 61. No one thought people go down there as tourists, but it's a very, very big thing today. And interestingly enough, a non-governmental organization, the International Association of Antarctic Treaty Operators, IATO, got together, set up rules for visitors down there, and they've been very good to the extent that the treaty organization, because I believe they meet every year, maybe an interim, and every 5 years they have a full plenary review of it, all the governments involved, to see if any modifications and things, lift the hood and see if you can tweak it a little bit. And they've never quite endangered, if you will, the voluntary rules for tourism there, which came into effect really probably after 66, which was when the first built for the purpose tourist ship was put into service in the Antarctic. And since that time, IATO got formed and certain rules were laid down. For example, no more than 50 people ashore at one time, and you can't do this, can't do that, and how to behave around the animals, the penguins, the seals, and so on. And it's worked very well. I've made 40 expeditions to the Antarctic beginning in 1971 when I was still in the Navy. And I've watched this, and the last time was, I think, 2014 or 12, right around there. So I've watched this over the years, and and it works very well. And those of us that get involved in Antarctic tourism are very careful to make sure we enforce through, I guess, moral suasion, because we don't have a police department, that everybody should obey the rules that we've all agreed to for the benefit of everyone. Because if we don't, it'll go into the treaty, which means it could get very bureaucratic if we're not careful.
I have two remaining questions. Well, actually, there are two different scenarios that I'd like you to expound on, just for the governance junkies that are listening to this podcast. So let me give two scenarios. One scenario is there is two people at McMurdo Station. One of them is a Russian and one is an American. And an American had been, let's say, they stole a case of research or equipment from the Russian, and the Russian wants their equipment back, but the American is not willing to give it back. In that case, who would enforce the personal property rights of the Russian, and make sure that it is given back to the Russian?
Well, you can look at the various bases or stations as excuse me, as we do ships. It's the flag that's on the base. So it'd be the manager or the director of that facility would be the one to adjudicate the problem. And so it was an American base, it would be the American manager of the base, the station, that would basically make those kinds of decisions.
Okay.
If it didn't work or to the satisfaction of either nation, then that could raise up to a diplomatic level, say the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., contacting our State Department and filing a complaint against what happened at the U.S. base in the Antarctic. But generally, that can be handled locally by the people in charge of each station.
That probably answers my second scenario, which would be what would happen of like intra-base disputes. Like, let's say some Russian researchers, they get intoxicated and decide to prank another facility. They start spray painting it with obscene letters and whatnot. It would be a diplomatic thing. Both the embassies in that case would be the ones that would adjudicate the dispute.
If it could not be done locally. In other words, I'm betting that because in that, you'd be surprised at the amount of cooperation between the bases in the Antarctic. It's a hard place. You're way out on the end of everything in terms of food, fuel, and all other amenities of the good life. They try, but it's a hard life. And so you kind of depend on other people. For example, the U.S. probably operates the biggest air service in the Antarctic continent because we have the aircraft, ski-equipped Hercules and helicopters and so on. Some of the other bases do have aircraft. The British station at Rothera in the Antarctic Peninsula area, they have an airfield there, and they have some aircraft. Basically, your aircraft fly in for the season. When the season's over, they all leave and go back north. So the U.S. Aircraft fly around a lot of researchers out on the ice, and no matter what country they're from. Of course, there's a scheduling problem and all of that capacity, but generally speaking, the degree of cooperation between countries and researchers is very high. They respect each other. You realize we're working on the same thing, that is to understand more about our planet. And that kind of nonsense, people misbehaving, probably results in being packed up and sent home on the next airplane. And so there's low tolerance for that kind of misadventure. Sure, you celebrate and maybe have a couple of beers too many, but they're outside that limit of being sort of socially awkward, if you will. If it's serious stuff, then the station managers, the Russian station manager and the American, would get together and discuss it and try and solve it locally. That they don't want to push things up into governments. You push it up into governments and suddenly you find yourself being handed down a packet full of rules that are difficult to work with and just make a hard life harder. So there's a great incentive there to take care of things like that very quickly and very forcefully. If somebody is really misbehaving, you just send them home. And that doesn't look good on your resume.
Exactly. I think that's very true. People often overestimate the amount of chaos in frontier or quote unquote Wild West. When you're out in that sort of situation, people try to adjudicate disputes by themselves and locally. And they also have some of a similar personality and ethos that just makes them want to settle the dispute rather than lead to more confrontation. It's a tough environment. Why make it worse?
Well, you're right. The kind of person who will volunteer for this sort of work is, in fact, a little bit different.
I totally agree. Frontier people, innovators, they have a different character. And I hope that the innovators and frontier people of the Startup Societies movement will use Antarctica as a template to make better, more peaceful, and productive societies going forward. Well, everyone, thank you again for joining us on the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Join us next time for great guests like Don here.